Good evening and a very warm welcome to the first of our Friends of the Bodleian lecture series for Michaelmas term 2021. And this is the first in-person lecture given by the Friends since February 2020, and it's wonderful to see you all in person here in the library. Professor Richard McCabe is sadly unwell this week. That's why he's not able to be here this evening. And I'm Lucy McCann, one of the archivists here in the Bodleian, in the Modern Archives and Manuscripts section, where we're delighted to have the Barbara Pym archive as one of our literary collections. I'll now introduce our speaker. It's my great honor to introduce Paula Byrne, who is joining us from Arizona today. Paula is the author of 5 best-selling biographies, including of Jane Austen and Dido Bell, and she's also written 2 novels. Her biography, her comprehensive biography of Barbara Pym, was published in February this year to great acclaim, based on work on the archive here at the Bodleian. And I will hand over now to Paula to speak on Barbara Pym at the Bodleian.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that kind introduction. And thank you to everyone at the Bodleian for inviting me to be the first speaker. This is a very exciting event. I hope you can all hear me. It's very exciting that some of you are there, as my children say, in RL. I said, what is RL? And they said real life, as though it's a completely different thing. But I know some of you are also Zooming, and so welcome to you too. I do have some slides, so I hope that will bring a little bit of life to the talk. And I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then it would be lovely to have some of your questions. I'll get started straight away. The Adventures of Miss Barbara Pym is the name of the book. I'm going to apologize in advance for the length. When I began thinking about writing about Barbara Pym, I genuinely thought that this would be a short book. Why did I think that? Well, I thought that her life was very dull. I was just to discover that it was anything but dull once I got into the wonderful archive in the Bodleian. But I'd anticipated it to be quite a short book. It's in fact 600 pages. It was double the amount of what I expected. So I apologize for that. And one of the ways I got around the problem of it being such a huge book was to write quite short chapters. And I very early on thought about writing the book in the picaresque style for reasons which I'll explain later. The other thing I want to say before I get started is that I came to Barbara Pym really late. Unlike many people who love and admire Pym, there's a whole legion of devoted fans. But I came to her late, and I came to her when I was living not in sunny Arizona, but in Oxford. And I discovered her in the bookshelves of a now defunct independent bookshop in Jericho. I was looking for something to read and something light to read. And the bookshop owner suggested Barbara Pym, and I confess frankly I'd never heard of Barbara Pym, and I just flicked through the first pages and I found myself laughing aloud, which I think is very unusual to make people laugh aloud when you're a novelist. It's a difficult skill, and the voice just felt incredibly fresh and I say funny, and I just devoured this book, and then was delighted to find there were 11 other novels to be devoured. So it was really, really rather wonderful. And that was the point when I thought, perhaps it would be good to write a new life of Barbara Pym, in the hope that it would bring Barbara Pym to a new audience. And also really at that point, I just thought, well, I'm really going to just write about the novels because they're so unusual, they're so brilliant, and the life is really boring, and I'll just have to live with that, and we'll just talk about the books. But I was wrong. So I'll just tell you a little bit to get you started. So Barbara Pym, she was born in in Shropshire, Oswestry, in 1913. She had one sister whom she was very close to, Hilary. And her mother, Irina, was very ambitious for Pym. She wanted Pym, they came from a lower middle class family. Her father was a solicitor, and they were very connected to the local church. But her mother she had high aspirations for both of her clever daughters. So she sent them to boarding school to Huyton in Liverpool. And from there, Pym went to, so this is a picture, a lovely picture I found of Pym's school in Huyton, wearing these the wonderful bonnets. And this was a famous chapel, a huge chapel that was built during Pym's time at Huyton. And she was a clever girl. She wasn't outstanding, but she was clever. And she did get into St. Hilda's, and she went up to Oxford in 1930. And when she was 16, she read a book that she said changed her life and made her want to become a writer. And it was an unusual choice, I thought, for somebody like Barbara Pym, who writes sort of gentle, in some respects, gentle comedies. But she read Aldous Huxley's novel Chrome Yellow when she was 16. And that book was the book that made her want to become a writer. She loved the book. She found it in Boots Circulating Library, which plays rather a large part in my book. I'm fascinated by circulating libraries and lending libraries. And the Boots Lending Library, now obviously defunct, was very important to her living out in the countryside. And she immediately, at the age of 16, wrote a parody of Aldous Huxley's Chrome Yellow. It was called Young Men in Fancy Dress, a novel by Barbara Pym. It's as I say, it's a parody of Chrome Yellow. And it's really about sort of posh people sitting around in country houses talking. And she later said, I had no idea what I was writing about, and I didn't really know many posh people, and I didn't know what I was talking about, but it was great fun. And it was the novel that made her decide to become a novelist. So she went up to St. Hilda's in 1930, beautiful college nestling by the banks of the river and close, of course, to the libraries. And she had a ball. She, at that time, as many of you probably will recall, there was a paucity of women. There were only a couple of women's colleges. And so Barbara found herself very popular at St. Hilda's. She did have a lot of girlfriends, but she also had a lot of boyfriends. And she seemed to spend a lot of her time chasing various men, stalking them by her own account. In the Bodleian Library, she would go to the library, and first she would apply her lipstick in the mirror, in the painting of Chaucer that hung in the Tower Room. It had a glass front, and she would apply her lipstick, and then she would stalk various men. She thought the Bodleian was just the best place for stalking. Little did she realize that one day it would buy her entire archive and be a source, just such a wonderful source for reasons which I'll talk about soon. So she went up in 1931, loved the library. She talks about hanging around the library. I found this in the archive. I just loved it because it's her Bodleian library card. Miss Barbara Pym, St. Hilda's College, main subject English literature. It was really very, very important. So she used to joke and say, do you think anybody would ever buy my archive? And this would be inconceivable. Will someday someone be sitting in the Bodleian reading my love letters? Well, yes, lots of people, including myself, found myself in that position. And this is a photograph of the library. There's wonderful portraits around the top there. She started keeping a diary. She began keeping a diary, and you'll see it in front of you there on the screen, in 1931. And the diaries went on until 1938, but she never stopped writing diaries. She changed the way that she wrote some of her diaries, but they are the most wonderful and valuable insight into the life of a young woman in Oxford in the early 30s. It was just a beautiful source. And of course, all of her libraries, all of her papers they're pristine, they're in this wonderful condition. And I do thank the Bodleian because they allowed me to take photographs on my iPhone of pretty much everything that I needed, which meant that I did have the leisure to come back home. And I have 3 children, I have a busy life, and then just really to focus in on these wonderful journals, diaries, notebooks, letters. And so that just proved to be a very invaluable source. When she was in her first term, I just want to show you the front page of this library. And this gave me the idea for the title, The Adventures of Miss Barbara Pym. She writes a record of the adventures of the celebrated Barbara M.C. Pym during the year 1932, written by herself, 1933, Saga of Gabriel Hervey, we'll come back to that, and then some mottos from St. Hilda's and other mottos that she liked. That gave me the idea of the title. She did see herself as quite a picaresque 18th century heroine. She certainly loved the novels of Fielding and Richardson, and she loved Jane Austen. So it seemed that because she saw herself as an 18th century heroine, I should perhaps write about her. And I was just rereading Tom Jones at the time, and I love the title of, in which Tom Jones goes to London and meets so-and-so. And so I based my biography on that, in which Miss Pym goes up to Oxford, in which Miss Pym finds a manuscript and reads it, in which Pym, and that was the basis for writing the book in that way. And this is a lovely picture of Pym. I think this probably is in the Shropshire countryside, and this is her in the year that she went up to Oxford. She's very attractive, but she was quite big boned. She said people described her as a Joyce Grenfell sort of character. And she was quite insecure about her teeth. She had very crooked teeth. But when she went to Oxford, she found herself feted by all sorts of men, including, this is a picture of her friends, her closest friends in St. Hilda's in the Subfosk. And this was a picture of Rupert Gleadow, who was the first man that she fell in love with at Oxford. And she kept everything. The archive is incredibly large, and there's so much of it. And she even kept, he sent a message to her on a library ticket, and she kept the library ticket and wrote, "This was the first item I ever got from Rupert Gleadow." He's a handsome man. And there was an incident with Rupert, which affected Barbara really pretty much the rest of her life, which was, it's almost certain that there was a rape by him, a date rape. Shortly after this happened, Pym became very promiscuous, and she split herself into 2 characters in her own mind. There was Miss Barbara Pym, the rather prim student, and then there was Cassandra, sexy Sandra, who wore red lipstick and nail varnish and a red satin blouse and black satin dress, and was promiscuous. So she did get rather a bad reputation in Oxford, and I talk a little bit about that. The second great love of her life, and in fact the man that became really the biggest love of her life, was a man called Henry Harvey, who was at Christ Church. She stalked him in the library. She sat opposite him in the library in the Bodleian and just waited for him to talk to her, and it took quite a long time. And then eventually Henry asked her on a date, and they went off to the trout by the river, and she bit his cheek, which is a little bit like Sylvia Plath when she first met Ted Hughes, and she bit his cheek, and not at all the sort of behaviour I would have expected really from Barbara Pym, but she bit his cheek, and they became lovers, and there was some bad behaviour from Henry, but she did adore him. There was another man in the friendship group, as the people say nowadays. This is a picture of Barbara Pym by Henry Harvey, just a pencil sketch in the Bodleian, which I like. And this is a picture of the trio. So there was Barbara Pym, the little boy, the boy in the middle who looks like a little boy, but he wasn't, is a man called Robert Liddell, who went on to be a writer, a novelist, wonderful novels. I'm sure some of you have read his novels. And if you haven't, I do highly recommend his novels. His novel about Oxford is called The Last Enchantments, and it's a beautiful novel about Oxford. I think it's probably is the best novel about Oxford I think I've ever read. And then there's Henry there on the right. And Henry and Miles thought Barbara was quite annoying, to be honest, when they first met, because she did stalk them. And she would always turn up on their door saying, can I knit you a socks, or darn your socks, or knit you a pair of socks? And they found it incredibly annoying, and used her. And then at some point in the friendship, she revealed that she was writing a novel about them, and they thought she was rather silly, and they didn't take her at all seriously until they read the novel. The novel was called Some Tame Gazelle, and it was a story set 40 years into the future, in which their circle of friends, she imagines their circle of friends living in a village 40 years from hence. And Henry and Miles were completely enchanted by the novel, and they just, for the first time, saw Barbara Pym in a new light, that she was incredibly funny and brilliant, and had written, while they talked about wanting to be novelists, she had quietly produced what, to my mind, is a perfect first novel. And that version of that novel, which is in the Bodleian Library, she printed it, she typed it up. Her father bought her a typewriter for her birthday, and she had it bound in beautiful green calfskin, in a lovely calfskin cover. But that version of Some Tame Gazelle is quite problematic. During her years at Oxford, Barbara spent a lot of time in Germany. She fell in love with a man who was close to Hitler, a man called Friedbert Gluck, and she got very close to the Nazi Party as a result of her friendship with Friedbert. And again, this is one of the surprises when I went into the archive. I had no idea that Barbara had this past, and she writes about being given a swastika badge, and she loses it on the Banbury Road. It's probably still there in the Banbury Road somewhere, but she loses her swastika badge, and she's crying, and she can't find it. And her friends Henry and Jock, and indeed Rupert, were telling her off and saying, look, you really mustn't get involved with these Nazis. They're really horrible people. But she was, like many young girls, and many people indeed, swept up in the Third Reich, swept up in the poetry. She spoke German very, very well. She thought the countryside was beautiful. She loved German music. She liked German film. And she just didn't see the dangers, like many, many people didn't see the dangers, and was naive really more than anything else. But going back to the first version of Some Tame Gazelle, there were lots and lots of Nazi references in that version. And Jock Liddell who wrote and read the novel for her and gave lots of advice, said to Pym, omit the Nazis over and over again. You've got to, it's not something to be joked about. Take out the jokes about the Nazis. And she couldn't bear to. It's quite interesting, the fact that she did destroy all of her letters from Friedbert, and she tried to erase most of the memories out of her papers, but there are some that remain. And yet she kept this version of Some Tame Gazelle in such pristine condition. It was as though she just couldn't quite bear to get rid of it. But it does make for quite sort of surprising reading. And then after her Oxford time, she came back to Oxford for a little while to work with Henry, who was writing up his thesis. She met and fell in love with Julian Amory. And again, that was another story that I had no anticipation, no idea of when I began thinking about writing Barbara's life, and was really surprised by this very, very passionate affair with Julian Amory, and really got caught up in his stories his story with Barbara, and he became a character that crops up in a version of Julian Amory. He might be called Julian Mallory, or he might be called, but a version of Julian Amory comes up in many of the novels. And again, we have this wonderful archive. He gave her a blue handkerchief, and that's in the Bodleian, preserved in the Bodleian, a flower that he pressed. And so he became a huge influence on Barbara. And again, it's just wonderful story. His own story, war story, was a rather sad one, which I probably didn't have time to go into today. But this is Julian Amory debating in the Union, and Barbara cut out this newspaper clipping of this very photograph, and she put it on her mantelpiece, and she always had a bunch of flowers underneath. She really idolized Julian Amory. He called off the relationship afterwards, which hurt her very much, and said that he wanted to be prime minister, and she wasn't quite the right sort of person for him, and there was some sort of bitterness about that. But he did remain a very significant person in her life. So during the war years, she went back to Shropshire when war broke out, and carried on writing. She wrote what I think would have been an amazing war novel. She called it her home front novel, and she started it, but she never finished it. And then she didn't go back to that novel, which is a shame, because she's writing it as in real time as war breaks out, and it's very fascinating. And she also wrote her war diaries, and again, I pored over these diaries in the Bodleian. They were just so fascinating, a day-by-day account of war breaking out and what it meant for her living in this village in Shropshire that actually was very badly bombed, partly because Liverpool was a main port, and Hitler bombed Liverpool mercilessly in the first years of the war. And Shropshire is very close to Liverpool, and the bombs that they didn't drop in the city would be dropped in the countryside. At the same time, evacuees from Birkenhead were sent to Oswestry and were sent to Barbara Pym's house. So they were given various evacuee children, and she writes quite movingly about those evacuee children who were sent to her during the war years. So she joined the Red Cross and then the APR. And I was just going to read a little bit from the book, about the book that wasn't published from her home front novel. So I'll just read a little bit if you'll indulge me in this. So this is just begins from the day before the evacuees arrived to Oswestry. Before the evacuees arrived, Barbara spent the day making blackout curtains for the bedrooms and dining room. Everyone cheerful, she observed in her diary. One aspect of the home front which Pym captured so well was the way in which many women were energized and invigorated by the war effort. The women of the host families had to deal with all the problems that came with the children, such as lice infestations and dirty clothes. Most of the Birkenhead children were from working class backgrounds and had barely left the confines of their own town before. In Pym's unpublished home front novel, Flora, the heroine, less sentimental than her mother, thinks it's bad enough talking to children of one's own class, but the lower classes were even more difficult. She's amazed to find the children hail from a family of 9. I expect the father's unemployed too, she thought, very prim and social and birth control clinic. At Mauder Lodge, Irena Pym's first thought was to take the 4 evacuees to the lavatory. Jane does the same in Pym's homefront novel, as does Janet in her short story, Goodbye, Balkan Capital. Janet had been so splendid. She had taken them all to the lavatory, which was just what they wanted. If only one had been able to think of it. For after that, they cheered up and rushed shouting about the garden until it was time for bed, which is precisely what happened to the children billeted with the Pyms, who were delighted to find a large private garden at their disposal. Pym, with her acute eye, was surprised to see how people like her mother, whom she often described as dreamy and vague, take up the challenge. In her Homefront novel, spinsters Agnes Grote and Connie Aspinall are asked to take in a mother and 2 children. When Connie finds head lice, she's determined to send the children away. No one could expect to have children who are not clean in one's house. But she is roundly reprimanded by Agnes. Send them away? Agnes stood in the middle of the room, a magnificent figure with a newly lighted cigarette jutting aggressively from her mouth. My dear Connie, this is wartime. Go and get the Lysol out of the bathroom cupboard. I shall wash the children thoroughly in the scullery, and their clothes must be dealt with too. Agnes bakes the evacuees' clothes in the oven to rid them of the lice and gives the children a thoroughly good clean as though she is washing a family pet. Pym is brilliant at showing the immediate sense of purpose and meaning that war brings to the women's lives who hitherto has been quiet and dull. All of a sudden, they are needed. Agnes makes plans to dig up the garden to plant vegetables to feed the children, and mild-mannered Connie feels the excitement of change. Oh God, don't let there be a war. But at the back of her mind was that a war might be rather exciting. It would certainly make a difference to the days that were so monotonously the same. The day after the children arrived was gloriously sunny. Barbara had a dull time, mostly telling the children not to do things. The fine weather made it difficult to believe that England was at war with Germany. Pym would wake every morning with feelings of happiness before the realization of being at war suddenly hit home. One of the effects of war was that the young women who were previously in domestic service, often left for service or factory work. Dilys, the family help, did stay on, but the Pyms were permanently anxious they would lose her to the munitions factory. Nonetheless, it was hard work running Maude Lodge with the extra lodgers, and everyone in the house had to pull their weight. The first few days were exhausting. Pym's war diary is full of references to washing, ironing, bed making, washing up, mending, sewing curtains and sheets sides to middle. One of Pym's jobs was to draw the curtains at night. It was a job she took seriously, as that the air warden officer who came to do the checks was also the grocer, with whom she was not yet registered. Rationing would begin a few months later in January 1940. After just 3 days, Pym expressed her hope that the war would soon be over. It was wishful thinking of the highest kind. So I just wanted to read a little bit about that bit of the book, partly because, as I say, the war diaries in the Bodleian are such a fascinating source for historians. You get a real sense of what it was like working in those early days of the war, and the novel that is unpublished. And also on a personal level, members of my parents' families who were from Birkenhead were also sent to families in Shropshire. So it was really fascinating to talk to my family about what their experiences were like as evacuee children. So it felt quite a sort of personal part of the book for me, that book. And then during the war, Barbara went to live with her sister Hilary, who worked at the BBC. And this picture is a man of a journalist called Gordon Glover. Pym lived with Gordon Glover's ex-wife and children, Julian and Prudence Glover. And Pym fell in love with Gordon Glover when he came to stay. He was estranged from his wife, Honor Wyatt, who also worked at the BBC. And he came to visit the children, fell in love with Pym when she was now living in Bristol. And he really did break her heart. And I think Pym felt that this was probably the last time that she was ever going to have a chance of a conventional life. And what I mean by that is what she meant by conventional life, which is marriage and children. And he broke her heart, and Barbara poured out her feelings in these wonderful, what she called sentimental journals. They're called After Christmas 1 and After Christmas 2. Gordon broke up with her shortly before Christmas, and she poured out her feelings in these emotional journals, and you really see a different Pym, not the normal Pym, who the sort of social observation, the comic timing, but a deeply emotional person. And she felt very devastated after Gordon broke off the relationship, and because of that, she joined the Wrens and went to Naples. There she is in her Wren uniform, and she had a marvelous time. And again, she kept writing. She wrote notebooks. She wrote unfinished novels, fragments, short stories, and it really was the making of her going to the Wrens. She was stationed in Naples. She met many great friends and many people, and I think it really helped her as a writer, her observations as a writer, and being in the Wrens. She had a good war, as they say. This is just an example here of some of her the stories that she was working on. And as you'll see here from the, how she went back and she crosses things out and she edits it out. She used to always use a blank page, leave a blank page on the left that she could write extra sentences. And I love looking at work in progress, and I love seeing how creatively she wrote. And so this is just an example of a piece of writing, and so with the blank page that she could add bits when she went back and forth. And then after the war, Pym, she had to earn a living. She still hadn't had a novel published. She had sent some Tame Gazelle to Jonathan Cape before the war, and he thought it had great promise, but the war broke out and he didn't feel sufficiently confident that it would sell. So she joined the Africa Institute. And I love this photograph of Pym at the Africa Institute, where she became an editor and a secretary to Darrell Ford, who was the president of the Institute. She fell in love with Darrell Ford. She fell in love with everybody. And then he also inspired many of her characters. But she carried on hoping and that she could become a published author. And she did finally become a published author. This is just another little example in the Bodleian of the notebooks she took with her. She would just, she would write little phrases, or she might be sitting on a bus and she'd notice something, she'd write it down, or she'd take little cuttings like you can see here. When Christianity is being threatened with new perils, I feel dismayed that the House of Convocation should debate with earnest interest whether any reader should place the alms dish on the altar. And she would put these little bits in, cut out and paste. And I think she did come from that war generation where paper's never wasted. So she would write on anything and everything, every little scrap of paper, every notebook she was given. So it was one of the great joys of writing this biography, was working my way through hundreds and hundreds of notebooks and looking at the creative process. And all of those have been preserved and are at the Bodleian Library. So the good news was she finally did rewrite some Tame Gazelle. She did omit the Nazis and made good changes, heavily edited, I think, by Jock Little, her great friend. And it was published, and she was finally a published author. And of course, that meant so much to Pym. She did receive good reviews. And most importantly, she had a stack of novels that she'd already started writing. And she carried on publishing those novels, Excellent Women, and very good reviews. They sold well, mainly to the library. The Boots, again, our friends, the Boots Circulating Library, were very important. They were a great supporter of her novels. And then a blow happened when she submitted her 7th novel to Jonathan Cape. And by now it was the 60s. And Cape refused to publish it and said it wouldn't sell, and that it was a swinging 60s, and that he felt that her novels were outdated and outmoded, and they were not the sort of novels. They were too tame and too calm. And another word he used that really offended her was that they were too cozy. And she would write in her diaries, what is wrong with being cozy? What is wrong in writing observational comedy? What is wrong in writing about people? So she was very depressed by being dropped by Cape. Roundabout, so offloaded, as she called it. And round about the same time, she met a man called, known to his friends as Skipper. He, you see him in front of you here, and he probably was the last great love of Barbara Pym's life. And they had a very intense affair. but Skipper was homosexual. He was gay, and Barbara knew it, but she was convinced that she could get Skipper to change his mind. And the reason I think he's so important is he did inspire, I think, her greatest novel, which is The Sweet Dove Died, and A Glass of Blessings. In A Glass of Blessings, a woman is torn between, she's married, but she falls in love with a man, and she doesn't realize that he's in fact gay. And it's a marvelously constructed and brilliant novel in which it's very clear to the reader what the subtext of the novel is, and yet the main character, Wilmot, can't, she's blinded by everything that goes around her. And then in The Sweet Dove Died, a wonderful character, Eleonora falls in love with a bisexual man. And it's a beautifully handled novel about the pain of being in love with someone who can't return your love. She did have a tendency to go for unavailable men. I think that was very much something in her psyche. So, but she did become very good friends with Richard Rogers and Skipper, as he was known. And but there was a terrible falling out, and she felt that he offloaded her, as Jonathan Cape had offloaded her, and it happened more or less at the same time. And she did fall into quite a deep depression because her whole identity was as a novelist, and then suddenly not to be a novelist was quite a blow to her. And the man who came to her rescue, rather bizarrely, was Philip Larkin. There's a picture of Philip Larkin and Barbara Pym here. Philip Larkin wrote to Barbara Pym saying that he was a fan of her novels, and out of the blue, and said that he was wanting to write an essay, a review essay, which would cover most of the 6 novels she published, and how would she feel about this. And so Miss Pym wrote back to Mr. Larkin and said she would love to do this. And she also told him that she'd been dropped by Cape. And Philip Larkin was incandescent with rage. He thought she was such a marvelous writer. He couldn't understand it. And he did everything he could to get, not only to raise Pym's spirits and to be a good friend to Barbara Pym, but also to get her published. He wrote to his own publishers, extolling her virtues as a writer. He really was a great friend. But it was a correspondence. It was an epistolary relationship. And again, we're very lucky to have both sides of the correspondence in the Bodleian Library. And it was wonderful reading these letters. And by now, it's Dear Philip. And they wrote to each other for 15 years without ever meeting. And they are absolutely glorious letters. They are funny, they're clever. And you see, in a way, both writers at their best. Philip Larkin certainly at his best, but I think Barbara also at her best. And she would write about that she was still writing, and she was keeping her manuscripts in the linen cupboard. She never thought she would be published again, and it's just a glorious correspondence. And then finally, after 15 years, they met in the Randolph Hotel. And it was a very successful meeting, and they carried on being friends. And then when Philip Larkin was chairman of the Booker Prize in 1967, Barbara Pym's 4-quartet book was shortlisted. And at that point, that coincided with the TLS review of the most underrated novelists of the 20th century. And both Pym was the only person mentioned twice. She was mentioned by Lord David Cecil and also by Philip Larkin. And at that point, her resurgence began, and lots of publishers were now interested in her, including Cape. So she had great fun in turning Cape down. She had this stack of novels waiting in the linen cupboard. So it was a happy story. She had these awful years, what she called in the wilderness, but it was a happy story. She did have a huge resurgence, and she did get shortlisted. She didn't win for the Booker Prize, but she didn't mind that at all. And so it was a happy story in Pym's life. And another unexpected story was old Henry Harvey, the man who broke her heart in Oxford and whom she always held a candle to, actually came back. He worked for a time in Finland, and he came back to live in a village near Warwickshire, and they became great friends. And when Barbara was diagnosed with cancer, he was a great friend. And it's rather moving to think that all those years ago, and she wrote that book when she was only 21, in which she was still friends with Henry, who is now an archbishop in her novel, and still holds a candle, almost was prophetic and did come true. And I write in the book, good old Henry was there for her at the end of her life. And this is, I'm sorry about the quality of this, I do apologize. This is my last slide. And this is the very last thing that she wrote. So this is when she by now knew that her cancer was inoperable. And she went into the Churchill, into the ward, and then the hospice later. And she was still scribbling those wonderful notebooks, writing about her surgeon, writing about the food. You see baked beans and sausage there. And right until the very end, she was writing another novel, and I say still writing those sort of glorious notebooks. So it was a great and wonderful experience. I don't think I've ever had. No, I've had one other archive. I think I wrote a book about Kit Kennedy, JFK's sister, which had a very, very full archive in the JFK Library in Boston. But I could never have written this book without the enormous help and support I was given by Richard Overton and the staff and the Bodleian. And I remain utterly grateful that, because this book is obviously heavily archive based, and they could not have been more gracious and more accommodating. And one of my hopes, aspirations is that more people use the Bodleian Library. And I think one of the librarians was saying that the archive has been consulted quite a lot in recent times, and that again, not only do I want to bring a new audience to Barbara Pym, but I do think this is an archive that yields many things for the social historian, for the interested general reader. So thank you for listening to me, and thank you for coming, whether you're in Zoom or in RL, real life. It's been an absolute pleasure, although it's a strange experience because I can't really see you and I can't hear you, but I'd love to have some feedback and some questions. So many thanks for listening this evening.
Right, thank you for that. So Paula, the question was, in the 1930s, after Barbara had left Oxford, and before the war, when she was traveling to Germany a lot, how did she support herself? Where was her income coming from at that time?
I think during the years, because she first went when she was still a student, and she actually went with the National Union of Students. And I think, like many people of her generation, she was supported by her parents. And they did fund. I mean, it just simply really almost before the war, it didn't occur to anybody of her class and her education to get a job. Now, that's not the same thing as saying she wanted to support herself by being a writer, because she did. But she was supported by her parents. And I remember feeling very frustrated when I was writing the book, and at one point thinking, what were her parents thinking of? Because they clearly knew at some point that they knew absolutely that she grew very close to this SS officer, and yet they continued to bankroll her trips to Germany. And I do ask that question in the biography. I say, what on earth were they thinking? Perhaps they weren't particularly thinking. So she was actually, yeah, she was bankrolled by her father, who was a solicitor. And she did, I think she got a grant as well. And I think with the National Union of Students, there was financial support, but it was mainly her parents. And I didn't remember thinking, she was still there in 1939 when most people were getting out, and she still went back. And for a while, she was living with Friedbert in Dresden, at which point he was very close to Hitler. And how much her parents knew about, but they must have supported. She had a flat, but she saw Friedbert every night, and he came back to her flat. But they did financially support that. But I guess they thought she was improving her Germany. I think she was, but perhaps not in the way they fully expected.
So the question is, did she have any regrets later about her relationship with the German officer And did she reflect on that at all in her diaries once the war had begun in the 1940s?
She did, and she was very remorseful. And it's fair to say that in the archive that we have, that there are huge pages and pages of remorse-filled pages, but there's definitely snippets where she says, how could I have ever loved a Nazi, and how embarrassed she was that she ever did. And a really interesting story with Friedbert was that Jock and Henry, who I said they were a trio of very good friends, they did not believe that that Friedbert was a bad Nazi. Now we're talking about, you know, the years before the war here, when people did not know what we know. But even so, they were saying these are thugs and these are horrible people. And they never believed Friedbert was a true Nazi because they found him intelligent and charming. And then Pym discovered via her sister Hilary, who worked with a very interesting woman who had dealings with the Nazi party and got, you know, very, very interesting woman. And she'd heard that Friedbert had turned his back on the Nazi party at some point during the war, which was an extremely dangerous thing to do and could have had him executed. And Pym writes and says, oh, maybe Jock and Henry were right all along, that his heart was never, he was never really, you know, is there such thing as a good Nazi, or is there not? And he wrote to her, we know that he wrote to her after the war, because she writes in her diaries, F wrote to me, and he was always F. But she didn't respond to his letters, and she destroyed all his letters, and she was deeply remorseful. But I'm surprised that she kept that copy of Some Tamed Gazelle, where she does use so much of the detail from Friedbert, including Friedbert had a framed photograph of Hitler next to his bedside cabinet. And in this first version of Some Tamed Gazelle, Belinda, who's the character based on Barbara, has the same photograph, just sort of little details like that. But yes, of course, she was remorseful, and she felt that she'd done her time during the war to recompense. But she also felt that Friedbert was a good Nazi, to be discussed. But thank you for the question.
The question is, it's clearly a very comprehensive archive, but are there any mysteries that the archive sort of didn't answer the questions that you'd like to find out?
Oh, that's a lovely question. Well, you know, the thing was, I found out many things that in the archive that I didn't know, and I think a lot of Pym scholars didn't know in the archive that she'd managed to keep hidden things. She was involved in a car accident when she was a young girl with her mother, in which 2 boys were killed, and just interesting things, sort of, that people were really surprised when I wrote the book. They never knew. And and she writes in her letters to Jot Little how awful, how crushed she was, how guilty she felt, even though it was an accident, but she felt so bad about this. And there were just little things like that. But the thing that I because I was writing the book from the archive, I didn't want to read into things that weren't there at all at any point. But I felt the one thing that was lacking was two things. One was her closeness to her sister. Now, I know she was really close to her sister, and they did live together in a cottage in Finstock, and were great friends, just as she'd imagined all those years ago. When she was 21, she wrote that novel in which the 2 sisters lived together, clearly based on herself and Hilary. But I'd never really got a sense of her relationship with Hilary, and that's partly because they were together, so they didn't write to each other, so there aren't many letters. But she doesn't really write about Hilary at all in her diaries, and that was quite interesting. I couldn't really get a handle on what was really going on. And the second one was her religious faith, because she writes a lot about the clergy, and in that great tradition of Jane Austen and Fielding, she often ridicules the clergy. They're a great source for caricature, stroke of genius to make pompous El Henry an archdeacon, and she does it so brilliantly, you know, at the age of 21. But also she was a woman of faith, and there are marvelous moments in various novels, such as Excellent Women, where Mildred will just go and pray in a church in the middle of the day when she's just feeling overwhelmed. But it was something she just doesn't write about in the archive. And I just really came to the conclusion that, like a lot of people, and myself included, Religion is a private thing. It's a personal matter, even to yourself sometimes. And it's something that you perhaps don't necessarily want to share. So there are very few references at all to any sort of, and there's a little bit about her worrying about losing her faith when she was ill, and how she thought that doctors were taking the role of clergymen. She writes about that very interestingly in her last novel, that instead of going to church, people were going to the local surgery, getting their bodies healed as opposed to their spiritual and their minds healed by a priest. And so she's very sort of interested in that shift in religion, but she doesn't really ever really talk about her religious feelings. And I felt that they were sort of the gaps, it's a good question. So I felt the two things that, and I didn't want to start saying, well, I think she thought this about God, or I think she thought that about God, because I just don't do that as a biographer. I deal with the facts and I deal with what's in the novels. But I was quite surprised that she didn't talk more about her religious faith and what the consolations of her faith, what it had given her, how it had sustained her. I mean, she talked a bit about the parish council annoying her, irritating her, so little things like that, but not in any sort of deep and significant way. So I thought they were the two things I didn't really find in, it was so comprehensive, that archive, and so brilliant, but I just don't think they exist. I just don't think, and she didn't write in her letters very much about her religious faith either. So it was very hard to get a full handle on that aspect of her.
Thank you for that. That was a wonderful talk, and I look forward to reading the biography. Just to maybe follow on from that, can I ask you a little bit about your own process of writing the biography? You've done a number now, and do you, gathering all this information, do you tend to write things in sections? Do you start and sit down and write it chronologically? What is your process as you work through this material?
Oh, that's a lovely question. And you know what, it kind of changes. And I also think it depends on, it really does depend on the archive. And you mentioned before the Dido Bell book, and which was the story of Elizabeth Dido Bell, who was a mixed heritage woman raised by Lord Mansfield, who was instrumental in abolishing the slave trade in England. And there was going to be a film made, and the film company reached out and said, would you write a book about this, because people will be very interested? And I said, well, I can't. I said, because there are only 8 known facts about Dido Bell. It's ridiculous. How on earth can I write a book about this? And they said, oh, I'm sure you can find a way of looking at the context. So that was another short biography, but it was really interesting because I did do a lot of context about mixed race people, Black people living in London, people involved in the slave trade. And so that was very different. And then, on the other scale is writing a book, Kit Kennedy, or indeed Barbara Pym, in which the archive is so vast that you could almost feel overwhelmed. So what I've tended to do in terms of the process, when the archive is very comprehensive and full, is to collate all that material. And I'm so lucky that for both Pym and Kit Kennedy, both libraries did allow me to photograph everything so I could do stuff at home. And it's just so brilliant doing it on your phone, because you can really zoom in. I can zoom in on this easily and see what is that word. And, when you're working in the manuscript room and it's quite pressured and it's quite hard to see sometimes, it was such a brilliant boon for me. And I'm the beneficiary of technology here, where I was able to, in the leisure of my own home, pore over this marvelous archive. So I would just I would take the notes first and really get an idea of the picture, obviously reread all the novels, and then I pretty much do work chronologically. And then, in this case, I would have all the archive on one file, and then my file on the other, and I would do a lot of flipping as I was writing, just to check that everything was right and everything was there. And it really meant that I was able to write the Pym quite quickly. But I handed it in a year before it was due, partly because of lockdown. I had a lot extra time on my hands, but also, as I say, because I had everything digitized, and it just made my life just so much easier. And I do, on the whole, find it easier to write chronologically. And then I tend to read everything else and all the other critics, and then don't do any more reading, just have it there in my head somewhere, and then just do my own thing, write the book that I that I want to read and the book that I want. So it definitely does depend on the content. And then I've always done this footstepping. I've always believed in footstepping, because when you footstep in you follow the trail of the people you write about, you see things that you would never have known when you're writing the book in an office. So I've always done that. When I wrote the Evelyn Waugh book about Oxford, I went very much in his footsteps. I tracked down the place in Venice where Lord Marchmain, the real Lord Marchmain lived, really to get a flavour and to give local colour. So I'm a great fan of footstepping as well, and getting out of the office, getting out of the library. Sorry, Bodleian, but it is important to get out and to see the buildings and to put yourself in that position of what it felt like to be in there. So it does depend on the archive, but it's so wonderful when I as I said, so lucky to have the Pym, and it's so beautifully it's all beautiful scrapbooks, and it's such a pleasure to handle and to hold. It's in such perfect condition. So I was so lucky. But that's a lovely question, and it does depend, but I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. That's been absolutely fascinating. I think we probably need to draw it to a close now, because we're sort of almost on the hour. But I'd just like to thank you again on behalf of everyone here in real life and other people who'll watch this later. It's been a real eye-opener into Barbara Pym, what an amazing person she was, and also into your writing process as a biographer. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a delight. Thank you.